Let me just jump in and get us started. So my name is Mary Eleanor Power, and welcome everyone. I am the Director of Marketing and Communications for Dalhousie University's College of Continuing Education. And for those who didn't hear, Charlene and I are located in beautiful Halifax, Nova Scotia, and delighted that you were able to join us. I would like to begin by acknowledging that Dalhousie University is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. And I'd like to begin by introducing Charlene Brockwell, who will be taking us through today's webinar, Trends in Continuing Education. Charlene has worked in the education field through her entire adult life, predominantly in language teaching. Some of her teaching experiences have included teaching language through theater in Italy, teaching English communication skills to children in Taiwan, and teaching basic to intermediate English skills to newcomers and refugees in Nova Scotia. She currently teaches English for academic purposes to international students at Dalhousie University through our English Language Studies department. So welcome, Charlene. Thank you for walking us through today's webinar. We're looking forward to it, and I will pass the floor over to you. But before I do that, I will just also emphasize that if anyone has questions throughout, please feel free to add it in the chat. And I will, as politely as possible, jump in and notify Charlene that there's a question. So please don't be shy. And Charlene, over to you. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mary Eleanor. So welcome, everyone. I should start by saying that originally I did this research at the beginning of 2020. I was commissioned to do a white paper on trends in continuing education. Obviously, the education industry has changed somewhat since that time. So you'll probably notice a little bit of discrepancy between some of the trends that I'm talking about and what's actually happening at the moment. But I'm hoping at the end of this webinar that we can have a bit of discussion around what kind of trends you are seeing currently in the education field because of COVID. So let's get started. I'll start with a little introduction, just in case there are some of you who are not as familiar with the continuing education field. Then move on to look at the kinds of learners that we work with, different programs that are trending at the moment, how things are changing in operations and delivery in continuing education units, as well as some of the future trends and disruptions that were discovered prior to COVID. So first of all, what is continuing education? So the definition is quite vague, in all honesty, because we cover so much of what is considered to be outside of the traditional college or university degree, formal education. So you'll find a lot of things like varying learning experiences when talking about continuing education. That can be geared towards personal or professional goals. Generally, continuing education takes place after some kind of formal degree or certification process, but that's not necessarily the case. Like with what I'm teaching, teaching English to international students prior to starting their bachelor degrees. When we look at continuing education, the different kinds of learning experiences that can be had, you name it, we have it. So there are different programs, courses, certificates, workshops, lectures, the length, the type of certification, it varies quite greatly, and it's tailored most of all to the learner's needs. What is it exactly that they're looking for or expecting from that learning experience? Even the terms that are used to talk about continuing education can vary from one institution to the next. So you'll see a lot of departments or units labeled as continuing education or have lifelong learning in the name, career development. I know our College of Continuing Education at Dalhousie, we're actually going through a name change process right now and trying to encapsulate everything that continuing education represents within one name is certainly a challenge. So let's look at some of the learners that we deal with within continuing education. Just before I start, there's a lovely quote by Marshall McLuhan. He said way back in 1967, already it is becoming clear that the main work of the future will be education, that people will not so much earn a living as learn a living. And I really, really like that phrase, learn a living, because I think it is quite apt to the education situation that we have right now. A lot of learners are having to learn continuously through their lives and through their careers. And so it's become a much more integral part of life. So I'm going to start with a broader perspective, looking at what do Canadians in general look for when they're going to do further education, what are their preferences, and how does continuing education fit into those needs? So one interesting thing that came from my research was that as education level increases, so do the chances of that student participating in further education. And you can see that in the chart here. So depending on the education level, there is an increase in the amount or the opportunities for further education. Now, I should say that further education refers to any kind of organized learning experience. So that could be with a teacher or tutor, or it could be using some kind of organized curriculum, okay? A really wonderful, I think, fact that came up was that 98% of Canadians agree that access to lifelong learning is important. And that's where continuing education is going to play a huge role because our main learners are that audience of adult learners, okay? Also very interesting that within 2010, about half of Canadian adults participated in some form of further education, which is really quite an impressive statistic when you compare to even 1 decade, 2 decades ago. We didn't see as many adults participating in further education because the need for it wasn't as strong. So I talked about what further education is, and I should maybe give a little bit of background for informal learning. So informal learning is any kind of learning experience that doesn't fit into the more traditional format of an education experience. So it could be something like, learning a skill from a YouTube video, or, having a friend teach you how to change a tire on a motorcycle, something like that. So this chart I find is really quite interesting because we see that between the ages of 18 to 60, it's rather consistent. About half of Canadian adults will participate in further education. And then, as they move into retirement, those education needs change. So they're not looking for qualifications. It's not needed for employment so much anymore. So their participation in further education decreases. Not a surprise. But participation in informal learning is quite high throughout Canadian lifetimes. So there is definitely interest in having learning experiences beyond the working world. And the question is, how do we tap into that? How do we get those learners into a more formal type situation? Now, a lot of times when we talk about continuing education, we often refer to our students as non-traditional students. This is the term that's generally used. So traditional students are viewed as the 18 to 24-year-olds, they're going into university or college right out of high school. They're usually full-time students. It wouldn't really be great to say non-traditional students are everyone else, because it's not entirely accurate. But non-traditional students tend to be mature students, but not always. They can be historically underrepresented. Students who have major responsibilities beyond just being a student. So things like jobs and families. Students who have delayed enrollment or have taken a break from education for a few years. Also students from lower socioeconomic households. Now, interestingly, what we're seeing in higher education now is there is a much larger number of non-traditional students participating in all forms of education, whether it's degree programs at a university or continuing education. So, as I said earlier, about half of Canadian adults in 2010. So that's a significant number. And because of that, we can see that non-traditional students really far outnumber traditional students. So higher education institutions really need to focus on how to tap into the non-traditional student market and shift that view from catering to traditional students. Since continuing education institutions have a lot of experience with non-traditional students, they can actually help to lead higher education institutions in that transition in attracting non-traditional students to their programs. Now, one interesting demographic that has been growing for continuing education programs are seniors and retirees. This is a really interesting one for us here in Nova Scotia because we have the oldest population in all of Canada. About 20% of our population is 65 years old or older. So it's a very large market. And nowadays, people see the value in keeping their minds active. Okay, and seniors and retirees, they have the time, oftentimes they have the money to participate in educational experiences. And looking through a lot of the continuing education publications and conferences and webinars, how to attract seniors and retirees is really a growing trend right now. Now, the types of programming that are designed for this demographic is really quite interesting. So you have the usual, I guess, stereotypical types of programs that you would expect for older people. So healthy aging, thriving in retirement, intro courses, things like gardening and birding. But what I found were the innovators are doing something quite different. So at Harvard, part of their continuing education department is called the Harvard Institute for Learning and Retirement. So this school caters specifically to this demographic, and how they do it is unlike anything else I saw in my research. So all of the courses are designed and delivered by retirees. So we're not looking at teachers or professors. It's retirees themselves who hold master's and doctorate degrees. Another interesting feature was it's not tuition-based, but it's subscription-based. So students can enroll in up to 3 courses per semester. Not surprisingly, there are no assessments because they're not taking these courses for any kind of qualifications. They're doing it just for the sake of learning. And the subject areas are really quite diverse. A lot of the subjects that you would find in a typical university environment are represented within the courses that they offer. I know when I saw this, I got really excited and wanted to move and maybe live in Boston when I retire. Another demographic that would be a good one to tap into, especially here in Nova Scotia, are immigrants. So as I mentioned earlier, the higher the level of education a student has, the more likely they're going to participate in further education. So interestingly, here in Nova Scotia, about 23% of Canadian-born residents have a bachelor degree or higher. However, within the immigrant population here in Canada, it's nearly double that, okay, 47%. So having that higher level of education means that this is a demographic we would be more likely to be able to attract to further education experiences. Another interesting thing, particularly for here in Nova Scotia, is that our population is increasing because of immigrants. We actually have a higher death rate than birth rate here in Nova Scotia. So our population increase is immigrants, and also interprovincial movement happening, which we're seeing a lot of this past year because of the pandemic. Now, not only does this demographic present opportunities directly, but the workforce in general can benefit from this as well. So when I was surveying the different programs across continuing education units in Canada, I saw quite a few that were geared towards employers and workforce increasing pluricultural skills. So I listed a couple of examples of courses that I came across. So things like cross-cultural interviewing, cultivating diversity in the workplace. And these are just two examples of the many types of courses that are geared towards helping build better relationships between all the people working in that particular location. Now, for learners, it's important to understand, well, what are the barriers? What are preventing our learners from actually participating in the learning experiences that we have to offer? So, not surprisingly, the big ones relate to time and money, not having enough of both of those. But you'll also see that some of the responses were related towards support, so having family support. And here in Atlantic Canada, access to childcare was also a big one. And interestingly, the last one, recognition for prior work experience. So a lot more students are looking to education institutions to have some kind of recognition for the learning experiences that they've had on the job or in a more informal setting. And that's where PLAR comes in. So prior learning assessment and recognition. More continuing education institutions are finding ways to integrate PLAR into their programming so that these learners can save time and money by not having to complete as many credits or as many courses to receive the same outcome. And 83% of Canadians think that post-secondary institutions should provide more credits based on past work experience. So the interest in PLAR is there. The tricky part is actually making it something that works within a continuing education framework. When we look at the wide variety of courses and programs that are offered by these units, it can be challenging to find ways of recognizing the different experiences that our learners have. So now let's move on to programs and some of the trends that I saw in programming. Probably the biggest thing that's happening right now when it comes to developing new programming is the use of partnerships. Okay. Partnerships can be with, oh my gosh, just about anybody. So I was seeing a lot of partnerships happening within the same institution. So for example, with other faculties, but there were partnerships with other universities or colleges, a lot of partnerships with the business world and various organizations that specialize in certain areas, communities, government. There are a lot of different ones out there. And among learners and employers, they're finding that these partnerships are important to the education experience, especially for those who are looking to be employed. They want that employability. So they want to ensure that they're getting these skills that will help them to either get a job or, maybe upgrade. So having those relationships with other stakeholders can really help programs be more relevant. Now, when I looked at areas that were developing new courses or that were expanding within continuing education, there were some trends. Obviously, technology is a big mover of new courses and programs, and you can see that in the list here. Things like cybersecurity and social media marketing. A lot of new course areas are based around issues that Canadians are facing right now. So things like environmental studies, gerontology because of our aging population, mental health and wellness, which I'm sure has seen quite a boom in the last year. One more area of programming that is expanding is global education. So there are more partnerships happening between Canadian institutions and international either education institutions or businesses. And the benefits are definitely being seen by the working world. A lot of employers are starting to look for skills that relate to international knowledge, intercultural skills, and these employers see the value that brings to their businesses. The last thing I want to talk about in programming is the skills gap. So this is a term that we hear a lot coming from employers, and it refers to the skills that the students who have just come out of their degree programs don't possess as they enter the workforce. But also perhaps the skills that an employee who's transitioning between careers might be lacking. And the skills gap is probably going to get bigger if we continue with the same kind of educational experiences as we are right now. For example, if you look at a 4-year technical degree, they estimate about 50% of the knowledge learned in the first year of that degree will be outdated by the time that student graduates. So it, not surprisingly, makes students wonder, well, what is really the value of this educational experience for me? Also, there's a huge disconnect between how educators view, how well they view their preparing students and how the business world views that preparation. Because only about 11% of business leaders agree that students have the skills they need for the labor market. Whereas on the education side of things, educators believe that, or 96% of educators believe that they are effectively preparing their students for the working world. So within that disconnect, it's no wonder that students are really wondering, you know, what value does this experience have for me? Now, these skills listed here aren't necessarily part of the skills gap, but they're skills that are recognized by LinkedIn. Okay, so LinkedIn has a lot of job postings, and they made a list of the skills that are most requested by companies for 2020. Now, keep in mind, this was before the pandemic, so I'm sure this list has changed a bit since then. Probably we would find skills that are lacking, that fall in that skills gap within these lists. All right, so now let's look at operations and delivery. So what we're seeing in a lot of continuing education units is a shift from running like a school to running like a business. So moving away from the education model to more of a business model. And it makes sense. So thinking about things like who do you serve? Who are your clients, and understanding that. Having a strategy and a position and making everything fit within that. Serving the students well. So customer service right there. A lot of these institutions are more proactive rather than reactive to the market. So things like the Harvard Institute for Retirees, looking at what the trends are going to be in the next year, the next 5 years, and making sure that we're meeting those needs for the students. Unfortunately, a lot of higher education institutions, because they're these large, massive institutions that have a long history, they tend to be rather slow to change. And unfortunately, it means that they're falling behind. They're not really meeting the needs and expectations of their students. So the focus on customer service was a huge part of what successful continuing education units identified as being crucial to their success. And a lot of it might seem like common sense, but within education, we don't see as much of it as maybe we should. So things like respectful and timely communication, having a user-friendly interface. This is a huge one. I know we've been doing work at Dalhousie on our website for our college, but if it's not easy to use, it's really going to be a big deterrent to the students that we're trying to attract. Ease of access or even self-access to records is an important part, as well as having straightforward procedures. I'm sure many of you have probably gone through the process of trying to get a transcript from a school that you went to many years ago, and it was probably less than straightforward. So making sure that these things are in place for the students are really going to help maintain a good working relationship with them. Now, one area that was identified as still being rather problematic for a lot of continuing education units is how easy it is to move between the CE departments and the greater institution, and move back and forth between the two. So there's still a lot of red tape and barriers, things within the schools that don't make it very easy for the students to move back and forth. Another thing that we're seeing within higher education institutions is the decentralization of these CE units. So there are a lot of good reasons to have a more decentralized structure. The biggest one is probably because it allows that unit greater flexibility. So it means that they can react much more quickly to changes in the market or changing needs of students. Now, I should say that decentralized doesn't mean deconnected, okay, or disconnected rather, because even the units that are decentralized still are involved in a lot of collaboration with other faculties and with the university or college as a whole, okay? But looking at the highlights that a lot of leaders of these units identified in 2020, the units that are decentralized, they saw greater success pretty much across the board. So higher revenue, greater enrollment, more new programming. And one of the main reasons for this is because government education cuts don't have as much of an impact with the decentralized structure. So in Alberta and in Ontario, there have been quite a few education cuts in recent years by the governments, and the centralized CE units really felt the impact of that and were struggling quite a bit as a result. Whereas the decentralized units, most of them didn't even mention that within their highlights, their reports. So now shifting to delivery. When we look at what students want as a learning experience, perhaps it's not a surprise to many of us that they prefer to be in a classroom. Okay. I don't know how much that has changed in the last year. It's possible that that statistic could be severely outdated. I don't know. But when this research was done in 2019, most students enjoy learning in a classroom setting. Okay. However, online learning is increasing. We're seeing a lot more students enrolling in fully online programs. And in the last 5 years, that has actually increased by about 10% per year. The number of online courses and programs has exploded in the last 5 years. And many of the CE units that reported on their highlights for 2020 mentioned that because they were expanding their online delivery, they were experiencing a much greater fiscal success than they had prior to that. So even though students prefer learning in a classroom setting, we are seeing a lot taking advantage of online courses and programs. And really, for adult learners, that does make a lot of sense because of their varying responsibilities, scheduling issues, things like that. Another interesting thing about online delivery, a lot of CE units have positioned themselves within their universities or colleges as experts in creating and developing online curricula. So they are facilitating that process and helping other faculties and departments to create online programming to offer more flexibility within degree programs. So there are some good things and bad things about online delivery, and I'm sure many educators here could tell me a few of them today. One nice thing is that in the working world, employers are accepting online degrees to a greater degree than they did in the past. There was a perception that online education was somehow of lesser value than classroom education, but thankfully that has changed quite a bit in the last few years. Online delivery can also reduce some of the barriers to education for learners. However, it also presents some new barriers. So as we've seen since all of the schools had to go online last spring, access to technology and materials can be a huge barrier when it comes to online learning. I know I did an online course, a chocolatier course several years ago, and I had to buy all of the equipment that I was going to use myself. Whereas in a classroom situation, I wouldn't have to do that. The equipment would be there for me, and it was not cheap. So that would certainly prevent a lot of learners from taking advantage of that education experience. Another thing that we're seeing is technological literacy being a barrier. A lot of people take for granted the notion that young people, because they're growing up in this age of technology, they're tech savvy, which is not necessarily the case. Online learning requires a lot of technical skills that many learners just don't possess for various reasons. And so that can be a barrier as well. Now, the last part of delivery, micro-credentials. Not going to go into this too much because there was a webinar on micro-credentials just last week, I think. But this is a huge trend right now within continuing education, and it's starting to become a trend within higher education in general. So 70% of the UPC members, if you don't know UPC, it's University Professional and Continuing Education Association. Okay, so 70% offer alternative credentials already, and 27% plan to offer them in the near future. So there's a really big buy-in among continuing education schools and departments in micro-credentials. And it does fit quite nicely with the types of education experiences that these units offer. Right now, the workforce sees micro-credentials basically as little add-ons or upgrades to already current foundation education. So things like degrees or certificates. They don't really accept the idea of micro-credentials as standalone education experiences. However, millennials, who are probably the biggest adult learning market right now, are pushing for those kinds of changes to happen within education. We've already seen those shifts happen in industries like music and television, where they don't want to have this one-size-fits-all experience. So we're seeing unbundling and repackaging of services. And that's starting to happen within education as well. It allows for a more personalized experience, and hopefully in the future, these micro-credentials can be stackable so that they can add up to something bigger. So let's look at future trends and disruptors. Again, I'll remind you, this research was done prior to COVID. So a lot of what's on this page, we're already seeing now. Okay, so shifts from large cohorts to very individual education paths, education being a lifelong pursuit rather than a once-in-a-lifetime thing, a shift from degrees to outcomes. We're seeing an increase in adult learners. That's already happening. Also, more progress in equity and inclusion is happening. And employers are acknowledging to a greater degree than in the past, skills-based competencies. So they're not necessarily looking for degrees as much as they were in the past, but specific skills that will help their employees be successful. So the first future trend I want to look at is stackable credits. So what we're seeing happening right now in the workforce is employees are much more transient than they were in the past. I don't know anyone who started to work in one business and continued through their entire adult lives. It is a very rare thing these days. So we have employees moving between different businesses and different careers throughout their lifetime. So because of that shift, we're seeing a lot of the responsibility for education being placed on the employees rather than the employers. So MicroCredentials can be really useful in that area. We'll probably see a transition from MicroCredentials being used as merely a supplementary form of education to a more foundational form. And that's where Stackable Credits comes in, because it would allow the students to customize their education according to their own specific career goals, and in the meantime also save them time and money without having to do courses, full courses in areas that might be irrelevant to their goals or their current employment. Subscriptions is another future trend that is anticipated. So subscriptions do have some benefits. The research that I came across showed that they can help schools retain students over longer periods of time. There's an increase in course completion rates for students who are using a subscription-based payment model rather than tuition-based. And there's the potential, to offer more flexibility for students when it comes to personalizing their educational experience. However, with subscriptions, it is really important that there are a wide variety of courses to choose from. If we're looking at lifelong learning, there are going to be a great number of skills that one learner is going to seek throughout their lifetime. Also, if an institution is planning on using subscriptions in a way that would incentivize quick completion of courses, those courses would need to be self-paced. So, the faster the students complete the course, the more courses they could get in an allotted subscription period. Another thing that subscriptions would mean for educational institutions is a bit more branding. So cultivating brand loyalty. So again, coming back to more of a business model. Now, the last disruptor that I want to talk about is blockchain. This is a really interesting one because even though it fulfills a lot of the current trends in education that we're seeing, it fits nicely with those trends. There has been quite a bit of resistance to blockchain within education thus far. So, some of the benefits of blockchain can mean reducing access barriers to education, better efficiency with administrative processes, and also facilitating movement for students between institutions and even countries. However, the interest in using blockchain or switching processes over to implement blockchain has decreased in recent years. So in 2018, 37% of higher education institutions weren't really interested in blockchain. They didn't have any interest in using it within their departments or schools. And that actually increased in the next year to 47%. Unfortunately, that report didn't get into any reasons why that might be. But an example that I came across was Wolf University. So this was a university that advertised itself as the world's first blockchain university. So this was happening back in 2018. By the time they actually launched in 2019, all mention of blockchain had disappeared. And it's a bit of a mystery. No one really knows why. It could have been logistic reasons. It could have been perhaps perceptions of blockchain. But unfortunately, the university has not released any information about why they decided not to go that route. Now, here's the one that I was waiting for, and I think we may have run out of time. I was hoping that we could discuss COVID and what you're seeing as being a disruptor, how it's changing education. But correct me if I'm wrong, we're out of time, aren't we? Mary Eleanor?
Yes, hi everyone. And so I have been monitoring the chat, which has been quiet, and I suspect that part of that might have to do with the fact that all of the questions that they have been answered throughout the throughout the presentation. So that can be one of the theories, but let me just, we are at our time, but let me just open it up to the chat again here. And those who are still joining us, please feel free to add any questions in here for Charlene. I'll also mention that we will be sending a follow-up email later today with a recording of today's webinar. So if you have any questions, we will have Charlene's contact information included. And feel free to share that recording that will be hosted on our YouTube channel. Feel free to share that with your colleagues when you receive it.
And also feel free, if you'd like to answer these questions and send me, what are you seeing in your own workplace in education? How is it changing?
That's great. Yeah, and a lot of what you touched on, Charlene, we are seeing now. Certainly, we're still seeing requests for or questions about when will we be offering face-to-face. And that can sometimes be specific to certain courses that really benefit from a more face-to-face model. But I mean, we're certainly seeing a lot more online offerings and a lot more that are offered at your own pace, to take at your own pace. So people interested in having the flexibility of tuning in at their leisure versus structured weekly participation. So that's certainly something we're seeing more of in terms of demand. And I think also, we're seeing interest and uptake in offerings like these webinars that allow someone to get a taste for what we're working on or for course content without necessarily making a financial commitment up front. So people are just interested to have that kind of initial taste, which is great. And we certainly appreciate that part of that might be motivated by COVID and its ripple effects. So yeah, those are just some of my own personal comments on it. But as Charlene said, we would welcome any additional comments from any of you. And with that, I suppose we'll wrap up for the day. And just let me see here. It's a great comment here. Great presentation as an adult learner, having online distance education has been fantastic during the pandemic. Thank you. That's great, Louise. Thank you very much for that comment. Really appreciate that. That would be a great place, I think, for us to wrap up. So thank you so much, Charlene. Really appreciate your time and your willingness to share some of the feedback here and some of the research that you captured in your white paper. And also a thank you from Darlene here. So lots of nice thank yous coming in. So thanks again, and take care, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.